In the past few months, I've definitely noticed a change in the tenor about how people have talked about trans medical treatment, particularly for children. And it really struck me because the way people are talking about it now feels like a clear deviation from the way it was talked about even just a few years ago. We wanted to bring together a panel of some of the earliest and bravest voices to challenge the mainstream consensus on medical transition for children, despite it being deeply unpopular at the time of each of their publications. Now, the conversation has changed, and we wanted to highlight their early work, which is, I think, responsible for the sea change. So let me introduce you to each person we've assembled for this panel. We have Jamie Reed, who published a bombshell piece as a whistleblower in our pages in 2023. She was a case manager at the Washington University Transgender Center in St. Louis Children's Hospital. And she saw her account was children being prescribed puberty blockers or medical transition without adequate psychological assessment or diagnostic rigor. We also have Emily Yoffe, who is a senior editor here at the Free Press. She has been behind the scenes editing some of the most important pieces for the Free Press on this very topic. She's also reported extensively, including a profile of a mother whose child was put on a puberty blocker by that same transgender clinic that Jamie worked at. And then she outlines how the clinic basically would not remove the blocker from her child. In the past 3 years, she has also continued to report rigorously on the serious failures in children's gender medicine. Jesse Singal is also joining us today. He is one of the earliest journalists to approach this issue with nuance and skepticism. In 2018, he published an investigation in The Atlantic looking at the rise of young people identifying as transgender. He's now working on a book about the ongoing fight over pediatric gender care in America. Many viewers will probably also know him from his hit podcast, Blocked and Reported, which he co-hosts with Katie Herzog, and his newsletter, Single Minded. So thank you each for being here for this retrospective. Well, I just want to set the table for listeners. In the last 2 decades, at least 100 clinics have opened across the U.S. to provide medical intervention for children seeking transition. You've each reported on this and had different perspectives and vantage points on this rapid expansion. Emily, let's start with you. Why did 100 clinics open to address this new phenomenon?
Well, that's one of the big questions that Jesse has helped answer, and history is going to answer. We went from none to 100. Now they're closing down again. But the West got gripped by an ideology, a kind of mania, and things people had never heard of before in their lives, such as we don't announce a newborn sex. We we assign a sex and then wait to see what happens later. Pregnant women, you're in the wrong body. Gingerbread people for young elementary school students being instructed that there's no such thing as biological sex. So it was quite a totalizing movement. And our institutions went along from education to government to medicine. The why remains a very good question.
Jesse, let's go to you. I know in your 2018 article, you talked about what seems like a bit of a rapid expansion. I'd love you to build on Emily's answer.
Yeah, I think when the first American gender clinics opened up around 2007, most famously the Boston Clinic at Boston Children's Hospital, they were seen as specialists who would treat this very small, specific group of kids. And the idea was these are kids who had gender dysphoria since childhood, and it had been severe since childhood and unwavering. And, then you would put them on puberty blockers, which were ostensibly temporary and would give them time to think, see if they actually wanted to go on hormones or get surgery. And it really was this niche specialty. And we saw this phenomenon where the numbers just exploded in ways that I don't think have been explained to this day. But this would not be the first time that doctors started treating one group of people with one group of symptoms and found that group getting larger and larger without explanation. And, Obviously the most controversial question here is how much of this has to do with social factors or with adolescent females, because it's mostly females seeking a transition on the youth side, at least, interpreting aspects of being a woman or going through puberty as gender dysphoria, and then seeking out care from adults who often, or at least in many instances, seem willing to provide it without much assessment or guardrails, at least in some settings.
Jamie?
So Jesse mentioned the first center's opening in 2007. The center where I worked opened in 2017 in the Midwest. So part of what we saw is how this kind of phenomenon spread across the United States and came into rural settings in different areas. But the way that the center in my clinic actually opened, it opened because a tiny group of parents demanded that it open. They created their own parental support group, and they went to the division of the hospital and they made a demand. They framed it as a civil rights demand, and the hospital eventually capitulated and opened it as a multidisciplinary center by 2017. There were internal debates within the endocrine division about that opening, claiming even back then that the evidence base was not strong enough for that center to open, something I had no idea about when I first joined in 2018. And by 2023, 2024, that center had essentially completely shut down.
Wow. I want to talk about what you each saw early on before anyone else at a time when it was just taboo to talk about. Before we get there, what gave you each the conviction to go against the grain and highlight some of the issues you were seeing that other people did not want to talk about?
I mostly have worked behind the scenes at the Free Press as an editor on some of our biggest stories, from Jesse's partner on Blocked and Reported, Katie Herzog, who did our first story about what is happening regarding gender and medicine. I was very happy to work with Jamie to get her first-person account published. Rita Kertu Kaltiala, who is a very prominent Finnish child psychiatrist who was one of the first people internationally to speak out against this. I worked with her. And then there are Abigail Schreier, who is a Free Press contributor, wrote an incredibly brave book about irreversible damage, about the transition of girls. So I was watching this happen, and I had been reporting on a different subject, the lack of due process on campus for accused men. And so I was very familiar with reporting on a thing that people didn't want to hear about. People didn't want to consider another side. People didn't want to question kind of excesses that were happening. So before I came to the Free Press, I helped at Persuasion to get Kira Bell, who's one of the the West's first public detransitioners, meaning she was a female, transitioned to a male, a double mastectomy at about 19, and then in her early 20s returned to her biological sex. So for someone who is willing to do reporting that makes people very angry and don't want to hear about it, this seemed like another case of just an incredible growth of a field of medicine that didn't exist essentially before, and then became a big moneymaker at many centers.
Jesse, I went back and I reread your 2018 piece where you touch on different sources that you had spoken to. One was Claire and her family, who I believe was 12 at the time and learned about the option to transition through a famous YouTuber. Another one was Max, who I believe went on hormone therapy and then later got double mastectomy. Can you tell us a little bit about that early reporting in 2018 that sort of painted the picture early on?
Yeah, I mean, I had just gotten interested in the question of detransitioners because their stories seemed interesting and seemed worth telling. And there were these consistent through lines, one of which was people who are going through some degree of anguish, discovering this idea that they can change their body and that it will make them feel better. And I don't know about in those particular cases, but doctors and psychologists have often echoed that belief. The idea is that if a young person says they're trans and wants to go on hormones or blockers or get surgery, they should be given those treatments, and that it could be incredibly irresponsible not to. I mean, it's a cliche at this point, but this idea of would you rather have a live son or a dead daughter, this idea that your kid will kill themselves if they don't transition, became really common. And as I think Jamie alluded to, this became sort of a really unusual civil rights issue, the idea that 12 and 13-year-olds have the right to these very specific medical treatments that can have permanent effects, often do have permanent effects. It's been a total mess. Just the moral heat of the conversation paired with the lack of solid evidence for it. So yeah, I don't know exactly what drew me to detransitioners. I was influenced heavily by Alice Drager's book, Galileo's Middle Finger. I mean, her main thesis is that any concern for social justice has to be couched in good science. You can't have social justice arguments based on censoriousness or shoddy arguments. So I just think trans people, detransitioners, people who jump around between identities, everyone deserves access to good information about medical research, and that hasn't been the norm in the States.
If I could just say that Jesse, who was one of the first incredibly brave reporters covering this, mentioned as we were starting, this is not the first time we've seen this kind of crazed sweep medicine. An example many people give and say, this is the lobotomy of the 21st century. One of the doctors who was most prominent in publicizing and supporting lobotomies got a Nobel Prize in medicine. It took many years, and there were many victims of lobotomy before it was completely discredited. So there is this ability to lose its central mission to help people when an ideology grips it.
Well, one thing that struck me is that, Jesse, in your investigation, also Emily, your investigation of a young person named Casey, who I believe was put on a puberty blocker implant. And you reported out, the adverse consequences of that. Most of the left was calling these types of investigations hateful or transphobic. Can you tell us about some of the early reactions that you all faced when you started publishing this work? And also including Jamie's big whistleblowing piece, which talked about a wide variety of adverse effects within this trans clinic in Missouri. Let's start with Jamie.
To go into that a little bit, I don't think that's fully abated. So I think Jesse probably still has those same kind of allegations brought forward. I am very disappointed in the way this has become such a politicized topic when, in my mind, when I first stepped forward, I truly saw this as a medical evidence issue where there was evidence and there were harms being perpetuated inside of a children's hospital. And I felt confident stepping forward as a whistleblower. I also naively thought that whistleblowers were often revered and respected by the left. And I am a lifelong Democrat and thought that there would at least be some willingness to hear from these concerns. And I think one of the through lines where we are now, almost 3 years to the day since my piece came out, is that we have maybe only seen more entrenchment in the political sphere, not less. And that is very challenging for me to continue to see how poorly evidence is being received by the political parties in this country.
Jesse, what was the reaction in 2018 when that piece came out?
I mean, there was, widespread outrage online. I will say, I think it, as strange as it is to say, I think throughout this, if you could take a secret anonymous poll of Democratic voting Americans, I think most people understand that when you're talking about kids and permanent medical procedures, you have to be very careful. Also, most people understand that 14 and 15-year-olds feel certain things very strongly, and you can't necessarily let that really fully, they should have input in their medicine. But this idea, which you really do see from some of the top gender doctors, that kids know who they are. Fundamentally, most people realize that's not true. So I think the problem was less like the number of people on the left who believe this stuff and more just a subset of activists were very effective at shouting people down. I mean, even the New York Times, which reported on this, and I thought like a clear-eyed but pretty milquetoast way, like really giving activists their voice too. They were accused of transphobia. GLAAD parked a truck in Times Square accusing them of transphobia. So that's been the strange thing, is sort of the difference between the response I've gotten on Twitter and then X and then Blue Sky versus a pretty steady stream of emails from people who say they're liberal and Democrats, and I have no reason to disbelieve them. Basically saying they're in favor of trans rights. They just have questions about this particular area of medicine. So I think, like, I don't know if there's anything we can take from this for future controversies, that idea of pluralistic ignorance of like, I can't speak out about this because I think everyone else disagrees with me. I still think majority opinion on the left is probably pretty normie on this, to be honest.
We know that, Jesse. These polls,
there is polling.
The polls have been taken. Yeah. The country is overwhelmingly Republican and Democrats against transitioning of minors. They understand kids don't know who they are. They're kids. And I really do think it's the elites in elite institutions who are not reflecting what the average Democratic voter believes. And you two are really downplaying the reaction to your bravery. Jesse has been subjected for years to death threats. Jamie, there were prominent liberal-leaning journalists taking to X, et cetera, trying to discredit virtually everything Jamie said about what was going on within the clinics and discredit Jamie. Jesse came in and did some reporting on that, showing that at the clinic, a lot of the people who were leading trying to discredit Jamie were themselves fundraisers for the clinics. But, it really raised the question when you saw these journalists organizing to shut down voices saying, look, we've got to look at the evidence. The evidence is very poor and shoddy for essentially sterilizing young people. Our profession requires a kind of skeptical stance toward everything. I'll listen, but I need some evidence. And the lack of curiosity was really overwhelming. I mean, I don't know what some of these critics thought was going on in a clinic that is trying to turn males into females and vice versa. Something pretty radical is happening at these places.
Why do you think it was that so much of the mainstream media was uncritical of what was happening, or uncurious, as you put it?
I actually have a little bit of a theory or concept that I felt even within working in the gender center, which is when I tried to raise concerns within the hospital setting, trying to raise concerns through the legal channels and then through the ethics channels. One of the responses was basically, oh, this is an LGBTQ issue. We don't want to, we're not going to touch that. You all need to figure that out. This is your issue. I did feel like there was this unwillingness from maybe heterosexuals or people who already had felt like they had been kind of put in their place, like, you can't question these things. So therefore, it's off, limits. We can't go there. I felt that within the normative channels that a hospital setting should have been open to looking at concerns. Concerns are being raised, and instead it was, oh, this is an LGBT issue. Y'all work it out. We can't touch this. We don't know what you're talking about. It was like we were so specialized on a high shelf that they didn't want to touch it.
I think the parallel to that is that during this period in journalism has been collapsing or imploding or whatever word you want to use. There's fewer science reporters than ever, but there was this expansion of sort of what you might call an identity vertical, or like a vertical dedicated to LGBT issues, which is fine and good. But the problem is there's this weird identitarian assumption that because you cover LGBT issues, that gives you some special insight into these, like, I mean, often not that complex, but fairly complex medical controversies. The other problem, which I was part of the problem here, if you go back and read my Atlantic article, I was much too deferential towards some activist groups, and I accepted this idea that, like, the science of youth gender medicine was basically in okay shape, except for these outlying cases involving detransitioners. And that was basically because I took what groups like GLAAD said at face value. And I think a lot of journalists do that. They say, well, this is a gay issue. This is a trans issue. What do? I call up GLAAD. They'll give me a quote. They'll connect me to an expert. And that'll be that. And it doesn't really matter what the subject is. If you are going to a group that has a particular perspective or a particular agenda, you usually can't just take that group's view at face value. You need to investigate it a little bit, which I definitely failed to do earlier on in my work on this.
But I don't think you would have been published, Jesse, in the Atlantic had you that early on said something really horrifying is happening here. Children are being harmed for life. They're being tethered to the pharmaceutical industry for a lifetime on powerful hormones that have enormous side effects, including sterility. If you'd really laid it out, do you think they would have published it?
It probably would have been more difficult. I mean, it's hard to say for sure, because at the time, I wrote what I believed. I had not looked as thoroughly into the history of the so-called Dutch protocols I should have. I thought the evidence base was pretty good. But yeah, I think one of the reasons the piece, which I mostly stand by, got published is because it did say, the doctors are more or less doing the right things. There's just this small area of disagreement, small but explosive area. When all these years later, I just I don't know. You can go back and look at the history of the studies that were published, and no one ever bothered to actually check by the normal standards of medical evidence whether these treatments work. And it left everybody in like a really unfortunate position. Most importantly, the kids going on these treatments and their parents who have to make these decisions.
Well, I want to talk about some of the concerns that were overlooked in this sort of haze period. You've each written about social contagion, for example. How has the prevailing understanding of it evolved since you each first began reporting on this issue? Jamie, let's start with you.
I'm still, strongly a skeptic in that the response that I still see from the activist orgs or from those who are still advocating for these treatments is there's still a complete denial that there could have been or that there is any element of this that is a social contagion. I prefer the term socially mediated, or, there were elements to this that clearly to any data scientists, it was screaming red flags. When my caseload went from 4 new patients per month in 2018 to 60 by 2023, there was an explosion exponentially that had to at least any good scientist should have said, let's pause for a minute, especially when the hospital had made its own predictions based on historical trends. They believed that there would be 50 patients total to ever really sit within this center needing care. And when I left, I had 1,500 unique patients from a 2-year sample set. I mean, when we also were seeing entire classrooms, when we would have a teacher contact and say, 9 out of my 27 students are trans identified, there was clearly an issue here that I am still appalled that, basic social scientists were unwilling to at least just say, pause, let's see if we can figure this out. At least ask the questions.
When Jamie and I were working together, she described this very classroom thing, but said the doctors in other contexts totally understand social contagion. That is why you have to be very careful when you talk about suicide, particularly with young people. There is a viral contagious aspect to it. So, all these child psychiatrists and psychologists, et cetera, they knew that. And they absolutely refused to accept it could be applying here. Lisa Littman, who is another hero of this, she's an MD, and she saw early on that something weird was going on, especially with teenage girls who almost overnight said, "Oh, by the way, I'm a boy and I need a transition. And the medical community would say no questions asked because this is her authentic self. And Littman lost her job at Brown University because the activists, went on a rampage against this.
From reading all of your work, it seemed that there was sort of a trend that, a child would express that they wanted to maybe socially transition, and then they were maybe put on a puberty blocker, which was seen, I think, for a lot of people at the time as like a neutral pause. Now people have a little bit of a different conception about what that choice actually meant. And some now see it as a step in a predetermined direction. What's the consensus now about the role of blocking puberty in the process for a child transitioning?
If I could just step in for just a second here.
Please, yes.
One of the most devastating aspects of this, when you look at the history of the Dutch Protocol, is most of these girls who were sucked into this from a social contagion aspect actually didn't arrive to a gender center until past puberty. And so they were oftentimes not being put on a puberty blocker. They were going straight on to irreversible testosterone. And huge numbers of the patients we saw were initially coming to the center at age 16. They were well past a puberty blocker. They skipped right to the irreversible damage to their vocal cords, to their urogenital tracts. Like, they immediately were put right onto irreversible changes that they will be impacted for the rest of their life. The puberty blockade and that Dutch cohort is still a very small fraction of who is actually treated in these centers. Most of them are put on irreversible cross-sex hormones.
The answer to like any question about the basic science of these treatments is we don't know. So the one theory that Hilary Cass in the Cass Review, which was sort of the biggest systematic review of the evidence and the biggest sort of just investigation of this area of treatment, she raised the possibility that in some cases puberty blockers could lock kids onto that track and make it more likely they'll go on hormones. Anyone who says that that's impossible, I don't know why they think that. I mean, historically, and this is a very controversial subject, but historically, a lot of kids with gender dysphoria, it went away in time. In some cases, it seems to be just part of the process of like turning into a gay adult or a gay adolescent as you go through a period of intensely gender nonconforming behavior. So there's so much we don't know about puberty blockers and their long-term impact. I mean, this has now been acknowledged by a lot of the big names in the field. So it's just striking in retrospect. And again, I think I was partly guilty of this early on, that we were so blithe about saying, well, they're reversible. It's time to think. It's a pause. Like, we don't know. And the only sort of comparative patient populations we had were kids who went on it for precocious puberty, which is very different because then you go off them and your regular puberty kicks in. And even there, as with Lupron, there were some bad side effects. So yeah, it's just I keep going back to this. It's just surprising how credulous people were and how effortlessly journalists and others just repeated what activists told them without looking into it. I'm frustrated by that.
And I think there is good evidence that, as Hilary Cass said in her report, this is the British pediatrician Jessie referred to, that social transition is not a neutral thing. And there are British studies showing that you socially transition a kid, that is, a girl at school gets a boy's name, gets a boy's haircut, vice versa. Then if you put the child on a puberty blocker, as critics of this have said, you cannot pause a human life. If a child's on a puberty blocker, that child's peers are going through puberty and having the physical, psychological, and social experience of it. And as has also just been mentioned, puberty itself is probably the greatest curative for gender distressed kids. It's historically been known that even those kids who are insistent, consistent, and persistent about having a opposite gender identity will go through puberty, and many of them come out on the other side and say, oh, I'm gay. That was part of my very young misunderstanding of myself. So I think there is good evidence for the dangers of this very early intervention, which sets kids on a path. When I talked to Kira Bell, she was put on puberty blockers rather late. It kind of simulates a menopause, which is not fun, and particularly not fun if you're a 15-year-old girl. And she said, I was just desperate for any hormone to make me, feel better.
One other thread that I was struck by across all of your work was a failure to look into the other comorbidities, body dysmorphia, anxiety, depression.
Autism.
And autism, right? Thank you. And then what came across to me is a quickness to assign gender dysmorphia as the diagnosis. Why was that, looking back?
It's hard to understand, but basically, if you really dig into the question of what the gender affirming model is, I mean, the basic is if a kid says there's something, you should more or less take that at face value. Within the gender affirming umbrella, there's very little clarity on exactly what that means in practice, especially because really young kids can get confused. Most people admit that, but these sort of folk beliefs attached to the gender affirming movement, one of them was that if you have a situation where a kid has a bunch of comorbidities and gender dysphoria, the gender dysphoria is what's causing things like anxiety and depression. And often you'll see specialists state very confidently that one is causing the other, but not vice versa. It couldn't be vice versa. And to me, that's just an ideological belief. There's none of us really to this day know much about gender dysphoria or what causes it. We have some decent theories, but the idea that anxiety or depression couldn't manifest as gender dysphoria, especially in an environment where kids go online and they see a lot of positive reinforcement for this idea, I think it just caught on as a way to sort of fight back against what advocates saw as transphobic arguments. Because from their point of view, it's transphobes who say, you're not really trans, you're anxious, you're depressed. So it's very strange. And I think it really opened the door to kids with a lot, just really troubled kids showing up at clinics. And, the social workers, the doctors, the teachers are trained. If a kid says they're gender dysphoric, that's the story, not the other stuff. And that isn't how, folks like the Dutch researchers did it back in the day. That's a pretty new and pretty American belief.
There was also a perfect storm, though. A lot of the huge rise in numbers happened right around the time we saw the changes in social media use, the cell phone use, the social media drivers with these kids, and then they were all on COVID lockdowns. And so we saw kids in some communities not have in-person school upwards of almost 2 years in some areas, and we saw huge numbers increase. There was this cultural moment where mental health really did tank for adolescents and young people right at that moment where you saw that gender dysphoria come in as this explanatory guide for kids. And one thing I do appreciate about adolescents, I have 2 of them, is, they're not dumb. They are seeking social answers. They look to their peers. They try to figure out solutions to their own problems, but they just don't have all of the mechanisms to do that. And for a lot of these kids, they did know that they were in distress. They were hurting. They were hurting for a lot of reasons. And for them, they thought that they had found the solution. And they thought it was the simplest solution. I just need this thing and I will feel better and I'll have a trajectory for my life. And where the adults really failed is we did not make sure that we took care of them in a way to recognize the complexity of the social situation we had put them in.
Well, at the end of the day, Jamie, your piece in particular sparked an investigation of the clinic by the Missouri Attorney General. And it helped lead lawmakers in the state and other states to pass bans on gender transition for minors. Can you tell us about the other outcomes of each of your reporting? Jamie, we'll start with you.
The one area that I am an outlier and the other 2 panelists is I'm not traditionally a journalist. I was traditionally an advocate and a medical advocate. And so post my piece coming out, I really did become a very loud advocate for taking a public legislative stance against these, interventions. The fallout of my piece, though, I think had some ripple effects. We did not see a lot of other whistleblowers, but I definitely have heard from others from within the industry and peripheral to the industry who, stepped forward, spoke out, You had a lawyer in the Free Press just about 2 weeks ago, Glenna Goldis, who lost her job with the New York Attorney General's office. I do think that the fallout from my piece did spark other conversations around whistleblowers, what it means to be a whistleblower now, and how that has really changed in our social media environment too.
RFK Jr., obviously out of the Trump administration, has called gender-affirming care malpractice. He has moved to prohibit doctors and hospitals from receiving federal Medicaid reimbursements for trans medical treatments given to patients under 18. He's moved to block all Medicaid and Medicare funding for any services at hospitals that provide pediatric trans treatments. The ACLU has announced plans to sue these rules. American Academy of Pediatrics has pushed back strongly. Why do you think people still are pushing back? I mean, American Academy of Pediatrics isn't exactly like what one would think of as a trans advocacy group. So I'm curious how you each understand.
But it has become one, and we did a big story early on by Aaron Sibarium looking in what happened to the American Academy of Pediatrics, and it was really hijacked by a tiny band, practically a one-man band, who was given the power to write new guidelines. And these are people who were doing medical transitions themselves. So they had a financial interest in this. And the powers that be at the American Academy of Pediatrics shut down people at their conferences who wanted to raise questions about it. But there has been a big fallout recently. Couple of weeks ago, there was the first detransitioner to win at a jury trial, suing her psychologist and her surgeon. This young woman's breasts were removed at 16, even though she'd been diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum and had many other comorbidities. The jury awarded her $2 million. A few days later, the American Society for Plastic Surgery, I hope I'm getting that right, came out with a lengthy statement. It was almost a mea culpa, what you're looking for, this acknowledgement. Basically, it said, we've been doing these surgeries and the evidence for them is poor, and our gatekeeping has been very poor. And we are quite vulnerable as a profession. And they kind of warned about the legal suits that are coming. There are more malpractice cases in the pipeline. So lawsuits have enormous power to stop a social contagion. And everyone's been waiting for the lawsuits to come. You brought up that the Trump administration and RFK Jr. are using their power to try to stop this. Republican states, Missouri, Jamie's clinic is shut down, have gone after this and stopped it. And I think there's no reason that this should be such a political issue. And I don't know, my colleagues here, I remain baffled that Democratic leadership seems to be going the wrong way instead of saying, we made a mistake here and we're going to be leaders in protecting the health of young people. Instead are going the other way and saying, we will be a sanctuary state. We will provide gender transition. And as we said early on, the average Democrat does not want to see a lot of children transitioned. So we're in a very strange time where more and more people are speaking out against gender transition, but because of the politics of this, we remain kind of stuck.
Well, 25 states, correct me if I'm wrong, have enacted laws that limit doctors from providing puberty blockers, hormone therapies, and surgeries, I believe. Do you worry about a situation where red states increasingly move towards restrictions, but blue states expand access, and then we're in this patchwork quilt-like scenario. I mean, similarity people might say is like abortion access.
It does seem like we're headed towards sort of a post-Dobbs like abortion landscape with youth gender medicine, which I think is unfortunate, and I wouldn't even know where to start to assign the blame. I mean, one thing you saw, these European countries that have centralized healthcare systems often have some particular body responsible for addressing the evidence question, or they have the power to assign someone that power. Now, in the US, we haven't done that. So the Biden administration could have at any point said, we're going to do a systematic review of the evidence. They didn't do that. They were cheerleaders for it. And, the Trump administration ended up commissioning an umbrella review, a review of the systematic reviews, which came to the same conclusion anyone could have expected, which is the evidence is not good. And I have a lot of skepticism of Trump and RFK Jr., but as I've said, the gods of bureaucracy have a sense of humor, because the team that actually assembled that review is folks I'm familiar with and whose work I trust, including Lior Sapir, who, even when I disagree with him, I think he's a good faith guy. I don't know if he's written for the Free Press.
He
He's certainly
has
been quoted here. Yeah. But I think this sort of increasingly schizophrenic approach where the rules are totally different in different states, it's going to lead to more polarization. It's going to lead to more chaos. And like for parents who put their kids on these treatments because they were told they would be life-saving, it is then terrifying to have them be yanked away. Whatever you think about the evidence base, that's not a great outcome either. So I'm worried that we're headed exactly down that road, in part because we have such a decentralized and dysfunctional system.
Since you touched on Europe, I just want to bring up one other thing, which was that it was interesting in reading your work that some of the European countries, Finland, Norway, Sweden, UK, all moved away from these practices at a quicker rate than the US. And I think it speaks to what we've been talking about, which is a bit of institutional capture by advocacy organizations. And I would just love to pick each of your brains on why you think the US was so resistant to following the path of European countries that often the left likes to point to in terms of their policy decisions. Why was the US so ideologically captured by this?
Maybe because of the lack of centralized authority. Professional organizations played a bigger part of the picture here. The American Academy of Pediatrics, the APA, the AMA, they would all put out these guidance documents, and the guidance documents themselves often looked very official, but if you dig an inch or two deep, there often wasn't much there, or there wasn't much transparency about how they were written. So I think that decentralization really is a big part of it. Plus, like this all occurred during the era of Trump, during the era of social media hyperpartisanship, and I think these are all like really poisonous forces when it comes to a complicated and fraught medical controversy.
The other element here, though, Jesse, you touched on this a little bit, is that an institution or the Democratic Party being willing to say, listen, we got medical evidence wrong, is very different from them saying, listen, we got medical evidence wrong, and in doing so, we potentially harmed a large number of children who would have grown up to be gays or lesbians, whose bodies have now been irreversibly impacted. That adds this level of the gravity of that error, to me, is so insurmountable. It's going to be one of the hardest things for most people to recognize and say, I got this wrong, and I got this wrong so terribly wrong, and I participated in hurting a whole cohort of people that are now part of the civil rights group that we uphold in this country. Those are huge things to be able to reflect back on and recognize the damage that's been done.
And unfortunately, it's much easier just to default to, okay, what's my tribe saying about this? So, Biden represents gender affirming care, no question asked. And Trump represents, we're going to try to bring criminal charges against some of these doctors, if possible. And why is this political? This should strictly be based on the evidence. But tribalism is so totalizing that here we are. And Lior did a piece recently for us, Jesse, where at the end, he describes that Democratic president could undo all the executive orders Trump has put into place on this. And, the wheel starts turning again.
Mm. And you're saying the risk is back and forth, like hot and cold between each presidential administration could have widely different impact on children every 4 years,
Right.
basically.
And that's when it's crazy. There's nothing intrinsically Republican or Democratic about this issue, but it has become, highly explosive.
I'd like to sort of start to close out by asking, what do you hope happens in the next few years? And what would be a win, in your view, around this debate?
I hope there's people actually examine why the big professional organizations did what they did. And I think we should be a little bit more skeptical about the role of activists. Activists are part of the big tapestry we have in this country for figuring out what policy should be and how to interpret evidence. But the sometimes fearful deference to groups like GLAAD or the ACLU on the part of journalists who should, as Emily said earlier, should always be skeptical. I think it's just going to go down as a pretty shameful episode because this is pretty high stakes stuff. I mean, these are kids being potentially exposed to life-changing medical treatments. And to just say, I'm going to turn my brain off and listen to what this advocacy group says is not good. So, I'm hoping my book can do a small part toward explaining how this happened. To me, that would be the best outcome, just some sort of actual reckoning with why it went down in the very disorganized and all too American way it did.
Jamie?
I think I see two pathways here. So one of the other historical similarities is something that was referred to as the satanic panic. And one day it was here, and then one day it kind of just burned itself out. And so there is this possibility that from a social standpoint, this concept burns itself out. I'm slightly hopeful of that. I have a 15-year-old and a 17-year-old. I see their own reactions in their high schools now when somebody brings up pronouns. They don't go along with this. So there could be that burnout on its own. Barring that, I'm going to be continuing to advocate for other organizations like the American Society of Plastic Surgeons to actually look at the evidence. The American Academy of Pediatrics, the Endocrine Society's original guidelines highlighted that there was very low quality evidence. I'm hoping that some of these other orgs will follow step. And if they continue to not do so, I will continue to seek legislative bans in every single state in this country that's willing to let me come to their capital.
I hope, as Jamie just pointed out, that social contagion or maybe social decontagion works on this area and that naturally kids, it's almost like a crack epidemic thing. You look at your older siblings or people caught up in something terrible and say, not for me. And I think Jamie's right that the allure of this for young people as a solution to life's problems is losing velocity. That's a very good thing. So there are fewer extremely distressed individuals who end up in this pipeline. I would also like to see, as we just talked about, the end of the depoliticization of this issue. And so the end of the ping-ponging. If we could we're not going to have some kind of assessment, non-political. It's not possible. But it'd be nice if everyone could agree, hey, this is about kids. So we're just going to look at the evidence and look at what's best for them and not be trying to score points against the other side.
I think it's a perfect place to end. I want to thank each of you for coming to do a bit of a retrospective on all of your work. I encourage everyone to read both Jamie Reed and Emily Yoffe, who are both in the Free Press. And Jesse, what's the title of your book?
Don't have a title
Do you have one yet?
No.
Okay, well, people could follow your newsletter, Single Minded, to follow along and get more information about the book when it's ready to publish. But thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, guys.